First tonight, the situation that arises when a landlord loses control of a rental property to a bank. It's a problem that's been highlighted for many years, but it still seems that all too often it's the tenant who bears the brunt. Tadhg Enright has this report.
Imagine coming home to the place you've rented for 6 years to find the lock's changed and a notice on the door telling you to contact a solicitor.
This is unbelievable. I can't believe this. What's this all about?
I don't know.
You've been paying your rent, but you've been caught in the crossfire between your landlord and his bank, which is repossessing the property.
We can't tell you the identity of the people involved, but this is a story based on real events. It was a fortnight before the authorities intervened and this family was allowed back into their home.
2 years ago, we looked at a problem we thought would have to be remedied quickly. That problem was that landlords were failing to pay mortgages on investment properties. Receivers for the banks were taking control of the troubled properties, and this was causing problems for the tenants who were renting them. For example, they couldn't get deposits back or get repairs done, and were often being asked to vacate at short notice. 2 years later, the problem hasn't gone away. Dermot McGee is renting an apartment in South Dublin, but now his landlord's property is subject to repossession proceedings.
About 3 weeks ago, I got a letter in the door addressed to the occupier, letting me know that the bank was looking to take repossession of the apartment. Bit of a shock. I like living up there. Didn't have any plans to leave, so wasn't entirely sure what to do.
Do you think this could have been handled better?
I've paid the rent every month. I've kept the apartment in good condition. I've kept up my side of the bargain. I've done nothing wrong. So at this point, it feels, considering I've done everything right, is frustrating.
So now you just don't know what's going to happen with your home.
I guess I'm a little bit worried that if things go badly between the bank and the landlord, that I'm going to be kicked out of my ear without any notice at all. I've no relationship with the bank, so I'm sure they've no interest in keeping me happy.
Given the fact that there's about 6,000 receiverships out there at the moment, that's an awful lot of people with an awful lot of problems. And I think part of the problem is just the uncertainty that's created, the very poor communication that comes from these accountancy firms who are acting on behalf of financial institutions, and just a sense of threat to people's homes. The tenant is treated as if they were the one who was in mortgage arrears, when actually they're the only one generating income for the bank in this situation.
Sandra Nelson signed a 2-year lease for her home in 2014.
It's a home that I really love, and I've spent a lot of time making it into a home.
In October last year, Sandra got a letter saying that a receiver would be taking over the property from her landlord.
I was completely distraught. I felt dizzy, you know, even just reading the letter. And it took me a few times reading over the letter because it's very written in a legal way.
Sandra got legal advice and started paying rent to the receiver. But Sandra's landlord had never given her a copy of her lease. And when she couldn't provide the receiver with a lease, she got another letter saying she was residing in the property unlawfully.
And they've given you 7 days to prove otherwise, or they'll change the locks just a week before Christmas.
I think that letter was particularly harsh because of the time of the year. I was going to be threatened with being evicted out of the house Christmas Eve, Christmas Day. I suddenly became completely aware that I didn't know where I stood legally and that I could possibly be moved out of this house and therefore be homeless.
Sandra got advice from Threshold. She continues to pay rent to the receiver and is trying to assert her rights as a tenant to stay in the property. And finally, there seems to be some good news on the horizon for tenants caught in the crossfire between their landlords and the banks.
There is legislation in the offing, isn't there? Do you think this will solve this problem once and for all?
Well, this legislation will make a big difference because it will ensure that receivers have to stand in the shoes of the landlord. In other words, the bank can't have their cake and eat it. They can't take rent from tenants and then refuse to carry out repairs, refuse to give them back their deposit. Obviously, we'd like to see the government go a step further and introduce a code of conduct on buy-to-let mortgage arrears, which would really deal with that whole issue about communicating with tenants, not frightening them in their homes, and making sure that they understand their rights and the obligations of receivers in that situation.
Well, I'm joined now by David O'Connor, the chair of the Irish Society of Insolvency Practitioners, and also by Lee Lindsay, who has recently received a letter from a receiver in relation to his own apartment. Thank you both very much indeed for coming in to us this evening. Welcome. Now, Lee, we'll talk about your letter in just a moment, but first of all, David, I mean, watching that report, seeing people getting a letter a week before Christmas asking them to vacate a property, coming home, another family came home to when the locks changed, is that in any way acceptable?
I would say no, it doesn't. I mean, it makes for uncomfortable viewing for someone who operates in that space. I'm not too sure the full details of that. I mean, I would always say as a receiver, when I take an appointment or any of my colleagues, to get legal advice to find out, you know, what you can and can't do. I can only assume in those cases that receivers did take legal advice and followed due process. The one thing that's missing in that, and I would also is the communication between the receiver and the tenant. And
but I mean, there was communication in these places. Well, it was a letter saying, get out of the property.
Yeah.
Or a note saying, we've changed the locks.
Yeah, and no, that's a fair comment. I'm just not too sure what has happened to get to that stage.
Tell us about the letter you received 5 weeks ago.
Well, about 5 weeks ago, myself and my partner received a letter that rather unceremoniously told us that the apartment had gone into receivership and that we had to provide rather extensive proof that we were the rightful tenant. As a tenant, you really want to know that your deposit is secure. You want to know that the place will be looked after and maintained, and you also want to have some idea as to when you're going to be leaving the property. And to myself and my partner, all of that just went out the window as soon as we received that letter.
David, can I ask you, I mean, the receiver, you want to get rid of the assets and get the maximum amount of money, but you're dealing with people's homes.
Yes.
Do we need legislation specifically to deal with this problem?
I think we do, and I think one of the key pieces is, as Lee mentioned there, the certainty of the length of stay he'll have, but also his deposit. And I think the proposals to have some sort of the deposit being held by the PRTB is a good solution.
But that's the law, isn't it? That the receiver is not obliged to pay it. The debt is between the landlord and the tenant.
Exactly.
I mean, do you accept that, Lee?
No, not at all. To me, when the receiver steps in, if they're expecting us to act in the capacity of a tenant, in that we're going to pay our rent month on month in a timely fashion, as the letter clearly stipulates, then they should act in the manner of a good and proper landlord, in that they will honour the deposit and that they will look after the upkeep of the property.
What we are hearing is certainly Threshold are saying there are significant problems here. We've seen instances where people have been asked to leave their homes weeks before Christmas, just a week before Christmas. Is the forthcoming code of conduct and change in legislation, is that going to be enough to prevent that happening?
I think if there is agreed practices, I mean, the deposit is one thing, I think that's useful. If there is an agreed practice that if a receiver is appointed, that a tenant must be given a reasonable amount of time to vacate, and whether that's a month, whether it's 6 months, I think something needs to be agreed.
Would you, as a receiver, call for that? I
wouldn't have an issue with that, and we affect that ourselves in our receiverships. Not speaking across the board there, but we would look for, I don't want to set the line of least resistance, but just something that works for everyone, because my job is to try and sell the property. So what makes it easier for me to sell the property is maybe come into a compromise position with the tenant.
Lee, David, thank you both very much.
Thanks, Keelan.